Hashem, today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Kuf, Zevachim 100, and we're going to start on the last three words of 99b. The Gemara has raised a contradiction in the position of Rabbi Shimon that, on the one hand, Rabbi Shimon says you can eat if you're an onain. That means to say, if you're mourning from the seven relatives, you can eat the Karban Pesach that night. It means say the night after Aninos is only rabbinically prohibited to eat kachim, and so therefore, since Karban Pesach is a mitzvah from the Torah to eat, and if you don't eat it, you get kares. Therefore, you can the rabbinic law does not override it, and you can eat the pesachim that the night after the Aninos. Whereas there's a different brisa where Rabbi Shimon says that you can't eat the Pesach the night after the Aninos. So this is a contradiction. So the Gemara says 5 answers for it. The first 2 answers we did yesterday, and now we're going to go on to the third. The first answer was, delete Pesach from the second brisa. And so therefore Rabbi Shimon says you can eat the Pesach after the Aninos. The second answer is no. When the Mishnah says when the brisa says you can't eat the Pesach after your Aninos, the night of the Aninos, that means the Shalmei Pesach, the Shlomim that are accompanying the Karban Pesach. Now we get to the third position, which is the position of Rav Mari Amar Lo Kasha. He says that Bryce is referring to 2 different cases. Kan Shemes Lomes Biyudalid. One is where one. So the Gemara says one Bryce is where Shemes Lomes Biyudalid, the cover Biyudalid. The Bryce that says that he can't eat it is because where the person died and was buried on the 14th, and so therefore it's Aninos Dioraisa, and so therefore it extends into the night. And Kan Shemes Lomes Biyu Gimel, the cover Biyudalid. One is where the person died on the 13th and he was buried on the 14th, where it's only an Aninos Dirabanan. Meis Lomes Biyudalid, the cover Biyudalid. If he died on the 14th, was buried on the 14th, Yom Misa Tofes Lelo Midiaraisa. Then the night after the Aninos is also, biblically speaking, still an Aninos, and therefore he cannot eat from the Pesachim. Meso Meis Gimel Ukvaro Biyudala, but if he died on the 13th and he was buried on the 14th, then Yom Kvura Derabanan. Then we're going to say the day of the burial is rabbinic, and therefore Eino Tofes Laila. Therefore, it doesn't continue until the night. The Yom Kippur D'Rabbanan Eino Tofes Leilo Elvin D'Rabbanan only rabbinically goes into that night. So therefore, we say don't eat the kachim, but you could eat the Pesach. Because there's no specific mitzvah there's no obligation to eat the kachim. It's just a mitzvah if you do eat the kachim. And now the Gemara says that Gemara has a problem with Rav Mari's answer. So Amalei Rav Ashi or Rav Mari. Rav Ashi says to Rav Mari, what about the following statement, which we learned in the Brisa, that Rabbi Yehuda says that it said in the Brisa, Amol Rabbi Shimon. Excuse me for 1 second. That Rav Ashi says to Amari, but what about the fact that we said in the first Brisa that the exchange between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda was that Rabbi Shimon said, Teda, I'll prove to you that you could eat the Pesachim that night. Shari Amru Onein Tovel V'ocholas Pisla, because it says in the statement in the Mishnah in Pesachim that an Onein immerses and eats the Karban Pesach of a little bit kachim. That proves that he can eat it that night. Name away, but why didn't? So that proves. And so therefore, that proves like Rabbi Shimon is correct, that you could eat the Pesachim that night. So, but why didn't Rabbi, according to you, where there's a distinction between the 2 cases, that Bryce is talking about Midrabanan, the Bryce that allows you to eat the Pesachim is where he's only an Onein Derabanan. Why did Rabbi Yehuda respond to him the following? Name away, Kaminocha Ana Yom Misa Diaraisa. I'm talking about a case where he can't eat the Pesach is where it's biblical. The Amr Sli has Yom Kfura D'Rabbanan. And you're giving me an example where he could eat it, where it was only a rabbinic onin. So kasha. Indeed, that's a question on that answer of Rav Mari. Abaye comes along and gives a fourth answer. Abaye Amar lo kasha, that it's not a contradiction between the two opinions of Rabbi Shimon. Kan shemeis kodem chatzos, kan shemeis la'achar chatzos. It depends when the person died. The actual obligation to eat the Karban Pesach only takes effect at midday. That's where the obligation to bring a Pesach takes effect, on midday on the eve of Pesach. So it depends which came first, the Aninos or the obligation to eat the Pesach. If he died, if the person died before midday, so therefore he became an onaim before he was fit to bring, or he had the obligation to bring the Pesach chaylei aninos. So therefore he's an onaim, so therefore he doesn't eat the Karban Pesach that night. But achar chatzos, if the person died after midday, the ichsei Pesach, that the person who's still alive had an obligation to bring the Pesach, or chaylei aninos. So then we say the aninos will not take effect on him, and he eats the Pesach that night. So mana temra. So then the Gemara says, and how do we know that there is this distinction? The shanile bein kodim chatzos bein la'achar chatzos. How do we know that there is such a distinction, as Abaye says, between before chatzos or after chatzos? I'll prove it to you. The Tanya, it says in the Brisa, la yitama. It says about a Kohen that he's not allowed to become tamei for his non-relatives, but for his sister who's unmarried, la yitama, for her he can become tamei. So, but the Bride says mitzvah. He's obligated to become tamei. Laura, so let's say he says, I don't want to become tamei because I want to have the Karban Pesach. Mitamino so al korcho. We actually force him to become tamei. Umaisa b'Yosef HaKohen. There was a story about this Yosef HaKohen. His wife died on Erev Pesach. He says, I don't want to become tamei. I want to eat from the Karban Pesach. The Kohanim, his brothers who were the Kohanim, took a vote. They said, no, you go to the Levaya. You go to the Levaya for your wife. So we see from here that the Pesach overrides the Aninus, and therefore you eat from the Pesachim. So that must be talking about a case, basically the Gemara is saying, where the Aninus only took effect after he was obligated to bring the Pesach, and therefore Pesach defeats Aninus. But Veraminu, because we have a contradictory source, so it says, and this price refers to a Nazir, and this source refers to a Nazir. It says, so why does the pasuk say achos? Let's say he's going to slaughter his Karban Pesach, or he's going to circumcise his son so that he can partake in the Karban Pesach. Because if your son's not circumcised, you can't partake in the Karban Pesach. And he heard that one of his relatives died. I might think he should go and become tamei, and then he won't be able to bring the Karban Pesach. Amris lo yitamei. No, it says in the pasuk, the Nazir is not allowed to become tamei. So I might think that just like he cannot become tamei for his sister, also for an unaccompanied dead body, a meis mitzvah, he should also not become tamei. He doesn't become tamei for his sister, but he does become tamei for a meis mitzvah. So we see in the first source it says we force him to come tamei for his sister, even though it means he can't bring the Karban Pesach. And the second source says we say do not become tamei for your sister if that means you can't bring the Karban Pesach. So what's the distinction? Lav shma mina kan kodim chatzos kan la'achar chatzos. Isn't the case where we force him to become tamei where this happened on Erev Pesach before noon, and so therefore he didn't have the chiyuv yet of bringing the Karban Pesach. And the case where we say do not become tamei, that's where it was in the afternoon, and where he had already had the obligation to bring the Karban Pesach, like the chiyuv that Abaye introduced. The Gemara is going to challenge that, but it's going to in the end reject this challenge and conclude that this is a good answer by Abaye. Mimai. So the Gemara says, why do we say that this is the way? The only way to make the brises whole with each other. Dilma, maybe it's the case. Maybe both cases are only after midday. V'har Rabbi Yishmael, v'har Rabbi Akiva, and maybe both braysos take place in the afternoon, and one brayso reflects the position of Rabbi Yishmael, who says you're not obligated to become tamei to attend the relative's funeral. And that's the position that says go do the Korban Pesach. That's the second brayso, and the first brayso, which says we force him to become tamei, is Rabbi Akiva. The Tanya la you tamei rishus. The Rabbi Shmuel says you don't have to become tamei for a relative. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says chova, it's obligatory. Gemara says no, don't say that. Lo salka daitach. The Reisha Dahi Rabbi Akiva Katana. You can't take that approach because the first clause of that brayso that says that we say you're not allowed to become tamei. That's actually the position of we know that brayso is not Rabbi Shmuel, but it's Rabbi Akiva who says it's obligatory. And so therefore, since it's obligatory to attend the levaya, so therefore you must say that it's before chatzos. We must say that Rabbi Akiva is saying, we must say that it's obligatory, and so it's Rabbi Akiva. And the fact that we say you're not allowed to become tamei in that case, it must be because it's after chatzos. How do we know that the first clause of that brayso is Rabbi Akiva? The Tanya, Rabbi Akiva Omer nefesh elu akrobim. When it says in the pasuk that kol yimei haziro Hashem al nefesh meis lo yavo, you're not allowed to become tamei, even for your relatives. Meis, those refers to elu arachokim, those who are not even those who are not your relatives. Aviv enu mitame, avol mitame hu meis mitzvah. For his father doesn't come tamei, but for meis mitzvah he does. Le'imo. What does it mean from the pasuk that it says is mother? That teaches us haya kohen vu nazir. If he was both a kohen and a nazir, le'imo hu deinu mitame, avol mitame hu meis mitzvah. You know, he doesn't become tamei for his mother, but he does become tamei for meis mitzvah. If he was both a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir, he doesn't come tamei for his brother, or matame will make mitzvah. So, what is it for a sister? And then it continues with the brayso. So we see from here that the brayso, the second brayso, which says that you don't become tamei, is Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Akiva says it's obligatory. So the only chiluk is like the chiluk that Abai suggested. That one is that when do you become tamei? When it's before chatzos, before the chiyuv of the Pesach kicks in. But after chatzos, then you don't become tamei for your relative. So Rava gives a different answer as to how, on top of kuf on the base, Rava gives a different answer as to how we can understand the contradiction between the two opinions of Rabbi Shimon. Rava Amar Idi v'Idi achar chatzos. Rava says that both cases take place after chatzos. V'lo kasha, and that means to say that both the brayso that says eat the Pesach and the brayso that says you don't eat the Pesach, they both take place after chatzos, and it's not a difficulty. Kan kodem sheshachto v'zarku alav. One is before. One case is before the Korban Pesach was slaughtered and sprinkled the blood, and there, under those circumstances, we would say, do not eat the Pesach that night. But after the Korban Pesach was slaughtered, then we would say, and then the person died, we would say, eat the Korban Pesach that night. So Rava Bar Masa said to Rava, I don't understand your answer. Rava Bar Masa is working on the assumption that normally what the most important part of the korban is the zrika, is the sprinkling of the blood. So he says, once you sprinkle the blood, you fulfill the mitzvah of the Pesach. So why it's already done at that point. So why do we care whether or not you eat it at that point? Rashi says, Hari nifter, you're exempt. But my dach yachil also. So why would we say that the eating that night rabbinically would push it off more than other kachim? Meaning to say at that point, the whole eating is only rabbinic. You've already fulfilled the Pesach. I understand that Abai says Rashi, Abai says we're talking about before you slaughtered and sprinkled it, and after chatzos, because the chovas Pesach is obligatory to bring, and if he won't allow him to eat it, then he won't bring it. Therefore, the rabbis said bring it. But according to Rava, why did they? He's already slaughtered and sprinkled it. Why are we going to allow him to eat it at that point? So I'm like, Ravina, no, it says Ravina because the Korban Pesach is different. Ravina responds to Rav Bar Mari, he says, Achilos Pesachim ma'akva. And we know that the eating of the Pesach, the Korban Pesach, you need to eat the Pesach. And if you don't eat it, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. You haven't achieved atonement. And how do we know that? Mita Rab Bar Afuna. And when Rava heard this, he said to Rav Bar Mari, go listen to what your Rebbe Ravina said to you. The Rab Bar Afuna. Where is this position of Rab Bar Afuna? The Gemara says, I'll show it to you. The Tanya, we learned in a brisa, and the whole brisa we're going to show that Rab Bar Afuna is going to explain the brisa to be referring to teach us this idea that the eating of the Pesach is ma'akiv. The Tanya, Yom Shmua ki Yom Kfura. So there are three. There's the time of the hearing. There's the time of the death. That's the day of the death. That's Aninos Dioraisa. Then there's a day where you heard about the death. And then there's the day where you collect the bones, which is an even later period of time. After the body had already decomposed, they would go out and collect the bones. So the brisa starts off by saying that the day where you hear about the death is like the day of the burial, the mitzvah shiva shloshim, that you have to keep shiva and shloshim, ulachilos psachim. And also with respect to eating of the pesachim. Implication is that you could eat the Korban Pesach on the day so we'll see what it means. And then it says, and then it says in the next line, so it says as follows, that Yom Shmuel, the day that you heard about the death, Yom Kfura is like the day of the burial with respect to the mitzvah of Shiva and Shloshim. U'achilas Pesachim, and the day, with respect to eating of the Pesach, that's like Yom Likud Hatzamos. That's like the day that you collected the bones. And now that's the first part. And then it says Echad Zeh, both on the day of the burial and on the day of the Likud. Tovo v'ochel kachim la'arav. You're allowed to immerse and eat the kachim that night. So the Gemara points out that there's an obvious contradiction in this brisa. Hagufa kasha. There's a contradiction in the brisa. Amris, the first part of the brisa said Yom Shmua, that the day that you heard of the death is Yom Kvura, is like the day of the burial. The mitzvah Shiva Shloshim is like the day that you heard about the burial with respect to Shiva and Shloshim. V'achilas Pesach, with respect to eating the Korban Pesach, it's Kiyom Likud Hatzamos. Meaning, say Pesach, you're not going to be able to eat it. The implication is only like the day you collected the bones, and you cannot eat it. Mikol the Yom Kfura, Afilu Erev Namilu Achal, which implies that the day of the burial is a higher level of mourning, and the day of the burial, even that night, you can't eat from the Korban Pesach. The Hadar Tani, and then the second part of the brisa states, whereas the second part of the brisa says that both on the day of the liquid and the day of the burial, you're allowed to immerse and eat the kachim that night, which is a double contradiction because it's saying that on the day of the burial you can eat it, whereas the first part of the brisa says you can't, and also says even on the day you collect the bones you could eat it. You could eat the kachim that night. So how do we deal with this contradictory? How do we deal with this brisa, which is hard to understand? So Rav Chisda gives one answer. He says Tanai. It's a machukas Tanai. We'll come back to that. The Gemara is going to have four ways to solve the contradiction in the brisa. First is Rav Chisda, but now we come to the answer, which is the reason why we're saying this brisa of Rav Bar Afuna. And Rav Bar Afuna says, Rav Bar Afuna Amar Lo Kasha Kancha Shama Shmua Al Meso Samoch Shkiyasachama. One is where he heard about the death right before the sunset. Or they collected the bones right before the sun set on the 14th of Pesach. And the Gan Shemeis Lo Meis V'Kavru V'Gan Achar Shkiyasachama. So, and one is where it happened after the sunset. It's already the night of Pesach. And so since the time of the burial was at night, then it's going to be viewed like the day itself. Meaning the source that says that you eat the Korban Pesach, that's where you only heard about it while it was already night. And so therefore it's like the day of the burial itself. But when you heard about it before the Shkia, then since then the day of the burial has concluded, and so therefore it's just rabbinic. It's rabbinic, and so then he would eat the psachim. But that's the second part of the brisa. But the first part of the brisa, which says that he can't eat it, that's where he heard about it after the sunset. So what do we care? Asked the Gemara. After the sunset, whatever happened, it's after sunset. Why would he's already brought the korban pesach at that point? Shema mina, achilas psachim. So we see from Rabbi Rav Huna's answer, no, we still make him eat it. Achilas psachim ma'akva, because eating it is essential requirement. Now, since we brought this price, the Gemara says other explanations about how to solve the contradiction. Rav Ashi says, echad zeh, when it says in the second part of the brisa, in both cases he immerses and he eats it. What does that mean? Echad zeh ve'echad zeh, echad kamer. Echad yom shmua ve'echad yom likut, tova v'ochel b'kodshim lo'erev. The Rav Ashi says when it says echad zeh ve'echad zeh, and it doesn't say both on the day of the burial and the day of the Likud Otzamos, it means to say that it goes back to the first clause of the brisa. Whether it's the day of the hearing or the day of the collection of the bones, Tov v'ochel b'kodshim lo'erev. Then you immerse and you eat the kodshim that night. Meaning to say, but the night that's after the Yom Kfura, you would be prohibited to eat the korban pesach. Meaning to say, during the day you immerse, and then you could eat it at night, because then you've already immersed. But Rav Ashi's answer is mistaken. Since the phrase echad zeh ve'echad zeh is referring back to the first clause, that the Yom Shmua is similar to the Yom Likud, and it's connecting to them. If that's the case, also the latter clause is dealing with Yom Shmua and the Yom Likud. And it means Zev, if it will be the case, Zev and Zemi, by the way, it should have said that if we're dealing with the Yom Shmua and Yom Likud, it should say Zev Zeh, not Echad Zev Echad Zeh. Shema mina bedusahi. So we see it's wrong. So then the Gemara says, and who are the, Rav Chutz said it's a machokas tanaim, my tanai. What is this machokas tanaim? The Tanya, we learn in the Brisa, that the Brisa says, Ad masai misonin olav kol hayom. How long does the aninos extend to prohibit you to eat kachim? The whole day and not more. Not more than that. Rabbi Omer calls man shlo nikbar. Rabbi says as long as the body is not buried. But when the body is buried, the aninos ends. The mayaskina. What are we talking about? Ilema b'yom misa. If we're talking about the actual day of death, mika the last slay, the yom misa, the toughest slay. Everybody would say that if it's a day of the death, the day extends into the night. Visu, and furthermore, Rabbi says, called man shlo nikvar, that as long as he's not buried, akvaro ishtarile. But if once he's buried, then the rest of the day is permitted. Mi ika delay slay achrisa kiyomar. Everybody says the day of the death is for sure an onen. So Amrav Sheshus. Therefore, how do we explain this brayta yom kvura that the brayta which says that one says he's an onen the whole day, and Rebbe says as long as he's not buried, that refers to only the day of the burial, and so therefore. We're going to see here that this is a dispute on the day of the burial, that which is rabbinic. According to Tanakama, it concludes at the end of the day, and therefore you would eat the korban pesach that night. Or according to Rebbe, it already ends at the time of the burial. So Mazka for Rav Yosef, well, what are you talking about? It doesn't work. Elohad the Ketani, it says in the Mishnah Psachim Hashomei Ameso K'Molakid Atzamos, that somebody who hears about his dead, that the shmua is like the day of the collecting the bones, tova ochel b'kachim erev, and you would immerse and you eat the kachim that night. Miklal the yom kvura, that means on the day of the burial, afilu erev nami lo achol, that the day of the burial itself, which is higher than the day of the likud atzamos, even that night you wouldn't eat. Harmony, who is it like? It's not like, it's not the Tanakhama, not Rebbe, because according to them, everybody would say after the day of the burial you can eat it. Elataret. So explain it as follows. You have to fix the language of the brisa. Until what point is he an onen? Kol oso hayom vilelo. That whole day and the night. Whereas Rabbi Omer calls man shlo nikbar. Avon nikbar but so Rebbe says he's an onain as long as he's not buried. But once the buried of a nikbar, then below Ilo. Then, but if he's buried, then he's no longer an onain that night. So Amrul Kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah and Amar Gavar Rabba Rabbi Yosef Lema Achi. Do we really explain the brayso with a great man like Rabbi Yosef say this? Lema the Rabbi Lakul is Rabbi saying that night is not an onin anymore after the day of the burial. So is that really the case? Lema the Rebbe Lekulav. You want to say Rebbe is lenient. Vantanya an masai mislon. Love calls machino nikbar. Vafil mikana sara yamim devi Rebbe. Rebbe says, as long as it's not buried, he's still an owning even until 10 days. So we see that Rebbe is more strict. Come say only that day. We have a different way to explain the brayso. An masai hu mislon. Love kol ayotzo yom below leilo. That whole day without the night. Whereas Rebbe says, Kolzman shlo nikbar, v'im nikbar tofes leilo. So Rebbe's strict. Even if he's buried, it grabs it that night. So therefore, we see from here that the Tanakh Rebbe are arguing whether or not the day of the burial grabs that night with it. That Rebbe says it does. And that's the Machokas Tanoim with respect to Aninos of the night after the burial that Rav Chisda mentioned. That basically, that's a dispute. That's how we explain this price. So the Rebbe says the night grabs the day, and the Tanna Kama says it doesn't. So Amrul Kamei the Rava, they said this teaching of Rabbi Yirmiyah in front of Rava. He says, "Midkama Rabbi Yom Kfura Tofis Lo Midrabanan." We call it the Yom Misa Tofis Leo Dioraisa. So he says, it says this proves if Rebbe says that Yom Leo grabs a hold of the day, rabbinically grabs a hold of the night. I mean, biblically, if it's the day of the death and the day of the burial, the day of the death, it should grab the night, biblically speaking. So that's going to be the next topic of discussion, but we'll stop over here. Baruch Hashem, we'll stop here.